So I personally believe that Lauren Faust is one of the best writers of the 2000s and 2010s. That's my opening statement for this, and I feel like it needs no further argument behind it, but for the sake of the video that you're watching right now, obviously I need to make some kind of argument as to why. So here we go. I mean, we obviously know some of the big ones. Powerpuff Girls, which practically jump-started her career in conjunction with now husband Craig McCracken, who both ended up continuing a huge working relationship with each other at the same time as a romantic one was taking off, with Faustus in the mid-2000s and Wander Over Yonder in the 2010s being two other examples of the duo's amazing work. But Faust herself had one particular project which she was tasked to bring into the new generation, in a sense, in 2010, when she was tasked by a certain toy company to show the world that friendship is magic.
My little pony, my little pony.
Welcome to In Transition, a video essay series discussing the personal thoughts, feelings, and views on the types of media that encompass my ongoing journey into becoming the woman I am today. And today we're going to be discussing one of the more unorthodox ones, but one that has had a pretty multiple shared experience with a lot of people in the trans community and in its own fandom, with My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic. Now, we all kind of know where this story all really began, didn't it? 4chan. And really, I could just leave this subsection of the entire video off on that note, and we could just move on. But to just leave the Brony Fandom as an example of that to 4chan, I'm not going to do that because 4chan doesn't deserve it, in my opinion. But if you're speaking to someone who did get into the fandom because of the experiences that grew off from that area of the internet, then we do have to discuss it in some capacity. Because just capping it off by saying 4chan accidentally created one of the biggest fandoms of the 2010s is giving 4chan way too much credit, in my personal opinion. And I feel like there's a lot more to this story than just that sentence alone. So let's have a bit of a deep dive, shall we? So instead, I will say this. The Brony fandom as a whole is a lot more important than where it was birthed on 4chan. Because if you scour the internet far enough and you find any of us online, and you find out for a fact that we called ourselves either a Brony or a Pegasister between the years of 2011 through to about 2019, and suddenly a lot of things will start to make a lot more sense in the long run. But what was really so great about a show that was practically just a relic of the late 80s to early 90s subgenre of TV shows that were basically made to just sell toys to young children? What was really so different from FiM that was different from every other generation that came before it? And I'll tell you why it was so different. Because the people behind it actually gave a shit. And I mean, this was a bunch of people that actually looked at the property of My Little Pony and pretty much said to themselves, hey, what if we actually cared? And they ended up writing some very good characters as a result of it. Instead of some cookie-cutter mold characters that were, okay, I guess they were still very marketable personalities. Well, I mean, My Little Pony actually did end up having some really good plots behind it. And I mean, well, actually, there were some parts in Season 3 that weren't that good, and the later plots ended up being a little bit interesting. And, folks, I am not going to be around the bush. My Little Pony Friendship is Magic was a good show, but it pretty much suffered around about at parts from the big thing that Hasbro was pretty much trying to do with a lot of its properties around about that period of time. And it fell sometimes into the trap of just modernizing what they already had. But to its credit, My Little Pony actually did benefit a lot from what had happened with it, compared to a lot of other properties that Hasbro had at the time, like, I don't know, Pound Puppies, for instance.
Secret but fun!
If we're being honest with ourselves, with over a decade's worth of knowledge, what could you really expect from the group that bought an entire network so they could put their product-selling shows all on at one time? You'd be a sucker, honestly, not to. And yet, oddly enough, it became one of the easiest methods of being able to showcase this new generation of the show to a wider audience. And that wider audience did come in time, although probably not how you would expect it if I'm being honest. While Hasbro probably thought they were only going to pull in their stock standard young and middle-aged girl demographic, bringing in Lauren Faust to write and create it oddly made it a lot more accessible for people across a large spectrum of audiences and had them tuned in with intrigue. Some came in out of a personal previous love of the franchise, others came in due to Lauren Faust being the creator of it, others came in for the lulz. But if you ask the majority of the people that got involved with the fandom when it really started out, they'll tell you how they exited it. Either as a very vulgar alt-right chud, or exited a queer mess. And guess which category myself and a lot of others fell into along that. You don't get a second chance for us for answering that, by the way, because the answer is pretty simple. Because this series managed to exceed expectations nearly every single week when this show would come on the air and episodes would be broadcast in the US. Granted, I wouldn't be able to figure them out until the next day when everybody else had already posted spoilers, but really, that's par for the course at this point, so it's whatever for me. At its core, the show itself is a simple lesson of the day format, right down to its Dear Princess Celestia format at the end of every subsequent episode. And really, it's just in general, the very point of it is to teach somewhat basic lessons based upon, which is very much typical of shows like this, and it's not a knock against it. But something spoke to a lot of people like myself and drew us in week after week to this show of pastel ponies with very interesting, if sometimes silly, plotlines. And at the end of it all, for a lot of people involved, while the show was definitely enough of an interesting romp to keep on coming back to it week after week, month after month, for 9 years? For the lot that stuck it out through 9 seasons of the show and nearly a full decade of it being active, there was a lot to really celebrate at the end of the day. As I've established throughout the majority of this video already, the show itself was a perfectly fine piece of media and honestly one of the best shows of the 2010s if you ask me personally. Especially what we got for the majority of that decade. But I feel like personally we would not have such a huge cultural impact that Friendship is Magic had if not for the mega die-hard fandom that grew out from 2010 through to 2013. And personally speaking, I feel like we wouldn't have such huge fandoms for shows like Steven Universe and Adventure Time like we do today if not for Friendship is Magic. And really personally, I feel like while we still would have gone in those fandoms if the Brony Fandom never really existed, I feel like overall those fandoms wouldn't really have that huge cultural impact in the same manner as Friendship is Magic, and I would argue that they'd be way less easier to access if it weren't for the Brony Fandom. Because the show itself is very much what you would think of it to be just by looking at it. And to be honest, it's kind of what we expected it to end up becoming. But when you break it down to what really kept people coming back in was quite simply just everything about it, from the characters to the plots to just the friends we made along the way. For me especially, I met a lot of friends that have lasted long-term connections as people in the community, both in real life and online at that. And to this day, I still manage to find people who were somehow connected to Friendship is Magic and the fandom it produced, often more than not being members of the varying LGBT spectrum, but of course the very obvious one being trans girls. In fact, in a bit of ironic IRL foreshadowing moment for yours truly, I've known about 5 people that I knew from the fandom in my early years, some of whom I even went to high school with, that ended up transitioning years into knowing them, and I often cite people such as them for coming out before I had even begun to consider it, for finally making me realize that it was a very real thing. And it turns out that those friends and myself weren't the only ones who had the exact same pipeline reaction to opening up themselves to their own personal identities. And it turns out that a majority of the people involved with the fandom at large ended up going down the same rabbit hole themselves. Whether it be for their own sexual or gender identity, everyone in some way or another found out more about themselves because of this show. In fact, since starting to write this script, one notable personality within the community, Eurobeat Odyssey, who went by Eurobeat Brony, known for making original Eurobeat songs and remixes for the show, came out as male to female recently, and the reaction from her community, as well as the people that have followed her since her time within the community, is simply wholesome and ultra validating if I do say so myself. Getting back on track a little bit here though, I do personally feel like queer culture as a result of that really does cling to Friendship is Magic quite quite a lot, because as we're about to find out, there are a lot of things within Friendship is Magic, and a few things I will specifically highlight, where the creators behind Friendship is Magic did try to insert a few more queer aspects to it that really did shine out quite a lot, despite Hasbro's mishandling of it at times. One of my favorite examples is the Big Back-centered episode Brotherhood Social. While its premise was very off-putting in a sense, given the fact that it centered characters having to dress in drag for it, it has one of the most poignant messages of any episode with something like this attached to it. Even more than that is the fact that the ending of it gives this idea that there are some levels of trans acceptance in its subtext, which obviously had to be completely watered down to hell due to executive meddling. But with what they could get away with, part of me really likes to see this as one of the many, many moments where I had another light bulb in regards to my own journey. But you know what? Personally speaking, I feel like even with the mishandling and the muddling up by Hasbro executives, I feel like that this show, looking at this through the lens of someone who actually watched it when they were still trying to figure out exactly who she was, and then properly figuring out slowly as to who she was, like literally as soon as the show was ending, I was starting to have the gears click in my head as to who I was, really. It really does speak a lot when I say this, that if I never watched My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, and if I never got engrossed within the Brony fandom, I don't think I would be on the road I would be on right now. If there's one thing I feel like I've personally been bringing up throughout this entire video, it's how great and important I feel like this show is to me. And how, without this show and the fandom that sprung up as a result from it, while I feel like I would have eventually have found that road to get to where I am, I wouldn't be where I am right now. The fandom this show produced is one of the big things I've touched on a lot in this, and there is a good reason why. But the show itself is one of the most wholesome experiences that I've actually been able to see blossom in real time throughout an entire decade of my life. To get the full scope of this, I was in the middle of high school when Friendship is Magic started out in 2010. And I was in the middle of basically going out and scoping around my entire gender identity, navigating throughout all of that, and basically figuring out everything in regards to how gender identity, sexual identity, and all of that really worked. And throughout that decade, I began experimenting with my own sexuality, my own gender identity, and by the time Friendship is Magic ended in 2019, I was on track to pretty much figuring out that boom, I'm a trans girl, and coming out to everyone who knew me personally and telling them, hey, I'm trans. This is who I am. No matter how you choose to look at it, Friendship is Magic was that big common denominator that was always there in the decade that has now come and gone, where I was able to basically just look at myself coming into the series and see a completely different person to the person I am now, who has come out of that show, but still resonates very strongly with that fandom. The show itself is a lovely experience that I'm glad I got to see from start to finish. And while the fandom itself was also a major driving force behind why I became myself due to how open and loving and overall accepting of it, and it led to some of the most deepest connections I've had in my life. Even some that I may not be as close to anymore, but they are still very much important to me personally. And it's due to those relationships that came with the show that was such a lovely way to help open myself up to that part of myself that always needed that extra kick in the ass to finally be realized. And that I probably find not just this show, but the people in it especially one of the most defining and important factors behind my journey to discovering myself. And that is the best kind of magic that friendship can give. And of course, like I've said before, I'm not the only person that's had a similar experience because of this fandom. In fact, she has actually had a very much more crucial experience in the fandom because of her shared history. So, to share her history with the Brony Fandom and how it really just helped her with her own identity, this is Missy to give her personal thoughts and views on the Brony Fandom and how it shaped her.
My name is Missy, also known as Mystic Genesis on the internet, and from 2014 to 2019, 2020, I did content creation, music, rapping, vocals in the Brony Fandom under the name Melody Sky. It was back in like 2012 that I first got into MLP. Like, depression hit really hard that summer. Just like one night flipping through YouTube recommendations back in 2012 YouTube, I came across just a video rip of the first episode of Friendship is Magic, and I watched it, and it was exactly what I needed at the time. It was just so simple. Like, all these people just coming together, being good friends, solving problems together. Like, it was so unlike anything else that I was watching at the time. I don't think it's hyperbole to say that it saved me. My experiences with being trans in the fandom started around, I want to say like 2017. It was around the time that like a few high-profile people were starting to come out. I distinctly remember Forest Rain, because I looked up to her like a lot at the time. I always knew the word trans. I was never taught that it was something that you could just be. So to see people just like starting to come out, speak their truth, I started like internet 2017 looking into what being trans was, and the more I looked into it, I'm like, oh, this is me. BronyCon was kind of great as a social testing ground for being trans, because like there's so many I started getting into like cosplay at the time, and I cosplayed Twilight Sparkle pretty much yearly for like the last 4 years of BronyCon, and it was great. Like you had like nobody batted an eye at cosplay. It was a great social testing ground for testing femininity, I guess. Like if you were feeling comfortable with that, and like nobody would judge you, like at least not to your face. I was never very loud about being trans in like the actual content that I made. Like YouTube was for my imaginative and like content and passion project stuff. I was very loud about being trans on Twitter, because for a community that was very off to the side, very bullied, very marginalized, like as fandoms went at that time, like there were even fewer trans voices back then, like even up to like 2019. So like I made no attempt to hide my opinion and my support for other trans people and marginalized communities, because like it's my responsibility. Like it's a part of who I am to be loud. And like even since then, like I ran into people at like BronyCon who recognized me, like not just for the music that I made, but also for the for what I say on Twitter, and how loud I am, and how supportive of trans rights I am. And if that's the legacy that I left on the Brony Fandom, then I mean, hell yeah. Like I could not ask for better.
Thank you all once again for watching this video essay on My Little Pony Friendship is Magic for in Transition. This has been a long time coming for myself, and I'm really glad for the fact that I've finally managed to get this out. And I really hope you all enjoy it, especially if you were a part of the Brony Fandom as well. Like, if you were personally a part of the Brony Fandom, I want to hear your stories about how it impacted you and your personal identity, if you do have a story with that, or just if you knew anyone in the fandom that really did have that sort of impact and sort of came out of the fandom as, well, this. Or even as somebody who came into the fandom a different person and came out somebody completely different. Like, after all, that is part of where my journey came from, so if you have a personal story like that, I want to see that down below. But until then, thank you very much for watching. You have yourself a lovely day, evening, or whatever time it is in the world for you right now, and I'll catch you later.